The air over Halabja shimmered with heat and dust, but what fell from the sky that day was not rain, not ash, not mercy. It was death itself. On March 16, 1988, the quiet Kurdish town in northern Iraq became the epicenter of one of the most horrifying acts of mass murder in modern history. What began as another day in the final phase of the Iran-Iraq War ended in screams, confusion, and silence, the kind that only comes when thousands die in minutes. Halabja was home to roughly 80,000 Kurds, families who had spent years caught between two warring nations. Many had grown used to the distant rumble of artillery and the thud of warplanes. But that day, the sound grew closer. Iraqi forces had been pushed back by Iranian troops, and Saddam Hussein's regime wanted revenge. Not against soldiers, but civilians. The message was clear: defy Baghdad and die. Survivors remember it starting with the whine of jets overhead. Then came the bombs. People ran to basements and shelters as explosions tore through the town. At first, they thought it was another air raid, but soon a strange smell crept through the streets. A sweet, almost fruity odor that burned the eyes and lungs. Mothers clutched their children, coughing. Men staggered into the open air, only to collapse where they stood. The gas was heavier than air, sinking into basements, suffocating everyone hiding below. Within hours, entire families lay motionless in the streets. Cows, birds, even stray dogs dropped where they stood. One survivor, a teenage boy named Kamal, later recalled seeing his mother and sister convulsing on the ground as he tried to wake them. Their skin had turned pale, their eyes glassy. He ran until he could no longer breathe, collapsing beside a tree that was already stripped of its leaves by the poison. The Iraqi Air Force had unleashed a lethal cocktail: mustard gas mixed with nerve agents like sarin, taboon, and VX. The attack lasted only a few minutes, but its effects lingered for days. By sunset, Halabja was silent except for the buzzing of flies. Some say the smell of apples, caused by one of the gases, hung in the air long after the bodies had turned cold. When Iranian troops entered the town the next morning, what they found defied imagination. Entire neighborhoods lay frozen in place as if time had stopped mid-breath. Women held infants still pressed to their chests. A man slumped over his bicycle, his hand reaching for the handlebar. The Iranians brought in journalists and photographers documenting what they saw. The images, piled bodies, blistered skin, twisted limbs, spread across the world. But despite the shock, most governments stayed silent. At the time, Iraq was still an ally of the West, fighting against Iran. Reports of the massacre were dismissed as propaganda. Some U.S. intelligence officials even suggested that Iran, not Iraq, might have been responsible. The truth, however, was unmistakable. The attack bore all the marks of Saddam Hussein's campaign against his own Kurdish population, Operation Anfal, a brutal effort to crush Kurdish resistance and erase their identity from northern Iraq. The man orchestrating this campaign was Ali Hassan al-Majid, Saddam's cousin. The Kurds would later know him by another name, Chemical Ali. He was cold, methodical, and utterly loyal to Saddam. In intercepted tapes discovered years later, his voice was recorded saying, "I will kill them all with chemical weapons. Who is going to say anything? The international community. Fakir-T, them." His words were not a threat. They were a promise. For years, the truth of Halabja was buried under political convenience. Western governments supplied Iraq with materials that could be used to make chemical weapons, even as reports of atrocities leaked out. Doctors who examined survivors described burns, blindness, and genetic deformities that lasted for generations. Yet, for a long time, the world looked away. The survivors of Halabja carried invisible scars. Many suffered chronic illnesses, skin diseases, and reproductive disorders. Children born in the years after the attack were often deformed or stillborn. The Kurdish population spoke of nightmares and ghostly visions. mothers seeing their dead children standing at the foot of their beds, fathers hearing the echo of voices calling from the past. In 1991, after the Gulf War, the Kurds rose up again, inspired by the idea that Saddam's regime was weakened. But once more, the Iraqi military crushed them. It wasn't until 2003, when the U.S.-led invasion toppled Saddam, that the truth of Halabja finally took center stage. Evidence emerged, documents, tapes, chemical test results, all pointing to the regime's deliberate extermination of its own people. In 2006, Ali Hassan al-Majid was captured. During his trial, survivors testified in graphic detail. One elderly woman stood in court, trembling as she described how she buried her husband and 3 children with her bare hands. Another man recounted waking up surrounded by corpses and walking for hours to find anyone alive. The judges played recordings of al-Majid's orders, his voice mocking the dying Kurds. When the verdict came, guilty of genocide and crimes against humanity, the courtroom erupted in tears. He was sentenced to death by hanging, but for many, justice came too late. By the time of al-Majid's execution in 2010, more than 20 years had passed since the attack. Thousands were dead, and countless more were still living with its aftermath. Halabja had become a symbol, not only of Kurdish suffering, but of humanity's failure to act. The investigation that followed Saddam's fall revealed just how systematic the campaign had been. The Iraqi regime had used chemical weapons in at least 40 separate attacks on Kurdish villages, targeting wells, farms, and entire towns. In one village, an entire wedding party was found dead, still sitting around the table. The gas had crept in so silently that no one even had time to stand. Halabja wasn't the first use of chemical weapons in modern warfare, but it was among the most brutal against civilians. Its legacy changed how the world viewed chemical weapons, leading to renewed efforts to enforce international bans. Yet even as treaties were signed, similar horrors would unfold in Syria decades later, proof that lessons learned in blood are too often forgotten. For the people of Halabja, remembrance became their form of resistance. Each year, on March the 16th, survivors gather at the memorial built on the town's edge, a white spire surrounded by the names of the dead. They light candles, whisper prayers, and hold photographs of loved ones who never grew old. The museum beside the memorial displays haunting relics: children's shoes, a bicycle, torn clothes, all recovered from the streets where they fell. One image, more than any other, has come to define Halabja: a father shielding his infant daughter with his body. Both died instantly. The child's small hand still clutches her father's shirt. That photograph, captured by an Iranian journalist, remains one of the most haunting symbols of war's cruelty. In the years after the attack, Western journalists revisited Halabja to speak with survivors. Many described the smell of apples as something they could never forget. Even decades later, a faint whiff of fruit would make them sick with fear. The chemical agents had seeped into the soil and water, ensuring that Halabja's agony would last long after the bombs stopped falling. One man, now in his 50s, told reporters, "We don't just remember the dead, we breathe them." His words carried the weight of generations living in a town built on invisible poison. Saddam Hussein himself was executed in December 2006 for separate crimes, but for the Kurds, that moment brought little closure. Many believed the world shared in his guilt for allowing Halabja to happen, and for pretending, for too long, that it hadn't. The true number of victims remains uncertain. Estimates range from 3,200 to over 5,000 dead, with another 10,000 injured or poisoned. But the attack's power lies not just in its statistics, but in its silence. For years, the world's most powerful nations prioritized politics over humanity, trade over truth. Halabja became a warning, a whispered question. How many lives can be erased before the world decides to care? Today, the town has rebuilt itself from ashes. Children play in streets where their grandparents died. The hills around Halabja are green again. But every March, when the wind shifts just right, some swear they can still smell apples in the air. There's a Kurdish proverb that says, "The wound may heal, but the scar remains." Halabja is that scar, a reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked, when voices are silenced, when justice comes too late. And somewhere, in the dust of northern Iraq, beneath the stones of mass graves and the ruins of old homes, lie the whispers of a people who refused to be forgotten. If stories like this keep you hooked, hit subscribe for more.